starting. All right, friends, welcome to week 3. This is Monday. It's our first lecture of this week. In total, this is our 5th lecture, which is like, whoa, time flies when you're having fun. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff today. And I know that there was quite some confusion this entire weekend about Flask and how to upload it and how to do that. My goal for today is to really take it as slow as we can. We're really going to dive into Flask. How do we download Flask? What is a micro framework versus an ORM? What is a virtual environment and why would we create one like that? How do we actually set up a Flask server? How do we run it correctly? I did have quite a few questions on this Hello Flask assignment, so we're going to kind of walk through that. Then we're going to talk about routing. Now, this is a large day, so we're going to talk about routing. Next, on Wednesday, we're going to be talking about forms and session, and that's really my 2 big things. And so I do want to take this as slow as we can because I want to make sure you guys understand it. And worst case scenario, we can talk about Jinja 2, which is our templating engine, and how to render stuff like that, and HTML, and how do we use Jinja. We can talk about that on Wednesday. If we have time today, great. But I'm not too stressed about that. We can absolutely talk about that on Wednesday. Cool. Awesome. I do just want to point out a couple things. First off, you have discussion posts. As always, you have those open right now. Make sure you do those. It's 2 a week that are necessary stuff you have to have done. There is no makeup discussion posts, unfortunately, so please make sure that you guys are doing them. If you are behind, you've gotten an email from Carly today, kind of letting you know where you're at, and if you're behind. So, please check your emails from there. Another thing is you have 4 core assignments. Now, we talked about from week 1, we talked about how week 3 and week 4 are kind of your heavy assignment weeks. This one, each week, you're going to have 4 core assignments. This week, you have checkerboard, which isn't too bad. And there's one thing about checkerboard that I'm going to circle back to, just to something we talked about in office hour that I want to make sure you guys know. Then you also have HTML table, counter, and Dojo survey. One thing about checkerboard is in office hours brought to my attention that when you are calling like 1 or 2 or whatever variable from your server PY to your actual HTML, you might get some squiggly red lines, and it might, whenever you're trying to do like the styling, right, where you say like the background color equals, and you're passing these colors. If you're getting the squiggly lines, but your code is working correctly, that's just a linter error. It's nothing to be afraid of. It's okay. As long as your code is working correctly. Now, if you're getting squiggly red lines and your code's not working, that would tell me that something's actually wrong. But if you are getting those red lines, but your code is working correctly, it's just a linter error. Sometimes VS Code doesn't really know, or you have something like a way, like when we have Flask and we have it downloaded in my terminal or open in my terminal and not actual VS Code itself, it'll get kind of confused. So just know that those are there. And if you do have that issue, but your code is working correctly for checkerboard, that's totally okay. Michael Choi, who is the founder of Coding Dojo, or one of them, actually does a video on checkerboard. So if you are confused, there is a video there for you to help you as well. One thing I did want to follow up with is a couple of you guys have talked about wanting access to the Django material. I went ahead and talked to our curriculum team about that, and they let me know that by the end of this stack, they will also be adding on the Django material for you. Obviously, that's not something that is necessary for your completion of Python. But if you guys wanted access to it, there will definitely be the material for the platform, all the videos, all that good stuff. All of the material, like if for any sort of Django stuff, that'll be on the platform by the time you graduate. And just as a reminder, whenever you do graduate, you get an additional 6 months of the platform or whatever language you took. So if you want to push Django to the side and then maybe learn that after, totally okay. We're going to talk a little bit about Django versus Flask, but just as a follow-up, their Django material will be available for you guys. Any questions on that? Any questions on any sort of this housekeeping stuff? Cool. Awesome. Sorry, and because I only have one screen, I don't see all of your lovely faces. It has to be minimized. So if there is a question, I am monitoring chat probably more heavily than I typically do. So just feel free to put something in chat. Cool. So we are starting today, and we're really starting our journey. These next 4 weeks are going to be the most intense you will have, just blatantly saying it. because what we're going to introduce is Flask today, which is what we call a micro framework. Then we're going to, next week, we're going to talk about MySQL, and we're going to learn about SQL language. Now, just so you know, that's an entirely different language that we will be learning, SQL queries. And that is an entire, you can get a job as a running SQL queries. You can get tons of jobs, especially with data. And if you want to work in data, SQL queries is something you must know. So next week, we're going to learn SQL queries. And then weeks 5 and 6, we will be combining the two together, learning how do we use Flask and MySQL and SQL queries together to make an entire full stack application with a database that we can save some sort of data, which is really fun. So that is what we are doing these next couple of weeks. But I do want to talk about Flask. Now, Flask is what we call a micro framework. So with any sort of language, whether it's Python or Java or C# or even JavaScript, right? All these big languages, oftentimes people create what we call frameworks. And there's tons of frameworks out there. The reason people create them is maybe the Python language does something really well, but they want to have some other pieces, maybe some shortcuts. You can kind of think about it like how I created aliases for my terminal. A framework might just be how people handle things differently, right? And they create a framework so that way it fits their needs. Now, Flask is very known. I would say the two most popular frameworks within Python are Django and Flask. They're both very, 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 very different. And we're going to talk a little bit about the differences now. Actually, we'll start with Django. No, I'm going to start with Flask, and then we'll go to Django. Flask is what we call a micro framework. And so it is not very robust, but that's actually one of the benefits of Flask. It will handle some things, right? It has some built-in functionality that you don't have to create whenever you create a application, right? If you were just using, kind of base Python or vanilla Python, you'd have to build out all of this stuff, all these classes, how it inherits sort of data or makes a query or connects to a database. But Flask will actually do that for you to an extent, right? But it's what we call a micro framework because it's not very robust. It doesn't have a ton of different built-in methods or built-in aspects. It is very, very just kind of bare bones. But that can be a huge benefit because let's say I want to create an application, but I don't need all this extra junk. I can just start with Flask. It's a great starting point, right? But I don't have to worry about all these different pieces and different things you have to do. It's kind of like, instead of maybe the way I like to think about it is if I'm painting, right? Maybe instead of me having to draw a horse and then paint a horse, maybe the outline of the horse is already there, but it's up to me to paint the horse, whatever color I want. If I want to, add a tail or some wings, or I don't know why I said tail, a horn or some wings or something. If I want to do that, it's kind of on me, but I have the base of what this horse is. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is a object relational mapper, which is Django, right? That is a very heavy framework. Out of the box, Django comes with a ton of things, a lot of stuff that you might not actually need, right? It can be very robust in the sense of it's got so many things. Like when you create a Django project, immediately you have access to an admin portal that's already built out for you. You have access to all of these different things. And what we'll be doing is making SQL queries to a database, and we'll have to do it in a specific SQL language. In Django, you just say .get, and it does it for you, right? It writes that SQL language for you. One of the benefits of that is, well, right out of the box, you have a pretty functional application, right? You could do a ton of stuff within 2 hours. You can create one with a admin portal that only specific admins and super users have access to. You can build in all these forms and do all this other cool stuff. But one of the downfalls is you have so much that you are maybe not utilizing that you're still downloading, right? That still comes with your entire project. You have all these files. If you guys are retaking, then maybe you remember in Django, we have all these different files and all these different things that we're dealing with, all these things that we're importing that we actually don't use. And so from a perspective of, which one is kind of better, it would be dependent on what your project is. As Flask is just the outline of the pony, I would say that Django is the paint by numbers of a horse, right? And not only is it the outline of the horse, but it really tells you what to do. And it's already kind of like, okay, the base is going to be this number 4, and then the mane is this color or whatever, right? And so it is much more descriptive. It's much more kind of built out for you, but that does have its pros and its cons. And so Flask gives us so much flexibility, whether I want to use Flask as a server for data, if I want to use Flask for creating a web application, if I want to do some sort of machine learning, I can do so many things because Flask doesn't have all these heavy things built in, and therefore it doesn't have all these dependencies on other aspects of the framework by itself. Does that make sense? Any questions there? I know that there's some chat about vendor name and stuff like that. Cool.
So can I ask a general question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a general question as it pertains to like languages and these, the various things. I'm going to get the terminology wrong here, but like all the various things that we're learning. Where are we, like weekly or otherwise, where are we supposed to be pointing to? Like, should we be able to remember like exactly what the syntax is for each of these things and what commands are used and all that stuff? Like, should we know it that inside and out? Should we generally know it and then be able to remind ourselves when we look on Google to remember how to do so? Like, where should we be at exactly?
Yeah, great question.
It's just a lot of different languages and different things.
Yeah, great question. So the way I would say it is, and that's something I've been trying to stress, is that remember when we were talking about functions and we were talking about conditional statements, right? And we were talking about OOP. Understanding OOP, understanding a class is important. How you maybe define the class or maybe the nuances of a class within a language is less important. Because if I need to Google how to define class in Flask, I can do that, right? If I need to Google how to define class in Java, which are different, right? I can do that. But understanding the functionality of the application as itself is key. Do you need to know the syntax of, how, some random import is working? Maybe not necessarily. Now, with what we're doing, it's obviously good to get familiarity, and I would try my hardest to understand everything that's going on. It's just how I would personally operate. But should you fully remember, some nuancy abstract class that we're bringing in? No, that's totally fine. It's these fundamental things, and that's why we try to, whenever we are creating these programs, right? Whether you're taking the 1 or the 3 or 2 stack class, the idea is we are giving you the fundamentals in every single language, because every single language uses a function. Everything uses functions, or methods in Python. Everything uses conditional statements. Understanding what a framework is, that is important, because if you go to C#, they have the ASP.NET framework, or if you go to Java, there's Spring Boot. There's all these different frameworks. And so understanding the idea behind framework, but do you need to know the nitty gritty of each framework? No, that's not necessary, unless you're trying to go into that framework, right? So if you're trying to become a Python developer, it's really important to understand Flask and understand how that's working, but you can pick up things along the way. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah, don't feel like you have to memorize everything. My encouragement, and this is just how I learn, so I don't want to say my encouragement. How I learn is I'm just going to repetitively do stuff over and over again. I personally, just one thing is on the platform when it has a line of code, like pip env install Flask, I don't like to copy and paste. I like to type it out, right? And I'm going to do that every single time until I get to a point where I'm like, oh, okay, pip env install Flask. Then if I have it, then super easy peasy, I can download and paste it, or copy and paste it. But I like to work with understanding the general understanding of what a framework is or a class is, and then from there, kind of building upon that, and it's transferable to whatever language you have. If that makes sense. Cool. All right. Now on to the big portion of today, and this is where I'm going to spend most of my time. is our virtual environments, and then our Flask route setup. And then I'm actually going to do routes. And then at the end, I'm going to do Hello Flask assignment. Okay. Now, virtual environments is something that can be very confusing. It's something that you can kind of ask yourself, well, why the heck am I going to do this? What's the point? What am I doing here? This is the way I like to think about it. A virtual environment is a way that we can solidify and compartmentalize and only use specific things that we need, right? It's a way that we don't have to like globally install everything, but I can say, well, for this project, I just need these dependencies. I just need Flask, or I just need bcrypt, or I just need this certain library. So I just want to keep it within this project. The way I like to think about it is this. I don't necessarily love to hike, but I like being outdoors. But if we can think about it, there are different types of hikes, right? I can hike in Sedona, Arizona, where it's hot, right? There's quite a few, like if you've ever been to Arizona, especially in like July or August, it is brutal, right? So if I'm thinking about hiking there or hiking the Grand Canyon, I did that one time. It's the worst feel of my life, almost died. You got to take certain things, right? You got to make sure you take a water bottle. Absolutely. You got to make sure that you're taking sunscreen. You got to make sure you're taking maybe like an electrolytes tab. Maybe you're taking a hat and sunglasses. You're taking specific things, right? Okay, so if I'm taking my hiking backpack, I'm going to pack all the things that I need for Sedona, right, to go hiking there. But there's also another type of hike. Maybe if you're hiking Mount Everest, right? You're going to have different things that you require in order for that hike to be complete. I'm going to need some sort of very thick jacket, right? I don't know what you need to hike Everest. I've never thought about it, but like maybe hiking poles, maybe those goggles, right? You probably have some sort of hand warmers or something like that, right? With that being said, those are both hikes. But I'm not going to have one backpack that I take to both, right? I'm not going to take a below like 30-degree below jacket to Sedona, Arizona. I'm not going to hike with that. I'm not going to take that in my pack with me. Doesn't make sense. I don't need it for that type of hike. Nor am I going to maybe take sunscreen or a swimsuit to hike Mount Everest, right? Because those are two totally different hikes, totally different dependencies for my hike. Same thing happens with our projects with Python, right? We here are creating a virtual environment. You can think about it like my hiking backpack, where I'm only going to put the things that I need for this project, right? For that specific hike, I just pack those specific things, right? If I am going to hike in Sedona and I know it's going to rain, I'm going to add in a raincoat, right? I just prepare for what I need in that specific hike. Same thing with a virtual environment. It's a way we can compartmentalize the libraries and the different dependencies we have within our code. So that way my project has access to everything it needs, but it doesn't have access to things like a below 30-degree jacket when it's 98 in Sedona. I don't need access to that. So it's a way that we can prevent sort of code bloat, and that we have all these dependencies and we have all these packages downloaded within my code, right, that I don't need. If I'm not working on a data visualization project, I don't need, matplotlib and pandas and numpy. I don't need that. So I don't need to add that to my environment. So if I'm just working with a project, I just want to make sure that I have access to the things I need to have access, but not more and not less. So that's where an environment comes in. And so with each project, you will have an environment. This is a very real world thing, right? Whatever you do for a job after this, if you go into software engineering, you will have dependencies and you'll have environments for your project, for your whatever you're doing. If you're working as a freelance person, or if you're working for a company, there will be dependencies and there will be different aspects you need. So different environments that you will have. So that's what we're working on here. Now, one of the questions is, can I have one virtual environment for everything? Yes and no. I say yes, only with an asterisk to it, because within this class, we're not going to be adding all sorts of different packages, right? We're going to be working with basically the same environment. We're going to be having a Flask environment. We're going to add in some different things, and that's it. But we want you to practice creating a virtual environment for every single project, because in the real world, you are not going to have two projects that have you're typically, I'm not going to say not going to, but you're typically not going to have two projects that have the same environment, right? You're going to have some sort of dependency. So we want you to practice each project having its own environment because that's how it's going to be in the real world. Cool. Any questions on virtual environments? Does that make sense? Can you guys put a 1 for me if that makes sense? Okay. So something that's important that I really want to point out is our folder structure for what we're using. So for Flask, we are using pip env. And now pip env, there we go. Pip env is going to be what we are using. And it's going to be very important for us to set up our folder structure in a correct way. Now, what happens a lot is I have people who maybe make a Flask folder and then they do just our Flask, then they create their environment within that Flask folder and then they put all their projects within that one folder. But one thing to point out and one thing to know is that you cannot have a folder that has its own environment nested within a folder that has its own environment. Doesn't work like that. pipenv will not allow that. So we have to make sure our folder structure is correct. Now here, if I'm looking at this, I have this folder called Flask TA right here. Within this Flask TA, I have two projects, test and CRUD. Each of these have their own environment, but Flask TA itself does not. So making sure that we are setting it up, you can have maybe a Flask folder on your desktop, that's fine, or however you want to do it, Flask and then fundamentals, and then navigate within that folder, whether it's Flask or fundamentals or however Flask TA. And then you create a project, and with each project, you have that environment. So make sure that your parent folder does not have the environment and you are just applying the environment to every single project. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Is that something that I know that can be kind of confusing? Cool. So we are using, there's different ways, and just know this, there's different ways to install virtual environments. There's different kind of tools that we can use, but this one we're using pipenv. So what you're going to do is you're going to, if you have Windows, you're going to go into your terminal and you're going to type pip install pipenv. If you're on a Mac, you're going to say pip3 install pipenv, and that is going to globally install pipenv. That is your environment tool. That's the thing. That's the backpack that we have that we're using to create our hiking environment. Cool. Now, I'm going to create a brand new file, right? I'm going to create a brand new folder within, I'm currently within, I'm in my Flask TA, right? I'm in that parent that doesn't have an environment, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. I'm going to call this mkdir example. I'm going to say Flask example. Perfect. Cool. Now I need to CD into that. Perfect. Now I'm in my Flask example, right? I have pipenv downloaded. I'm in there. Now, let's see what my next step is. I have downloaded pipenv, but now I need to actually create my environment, right? I need to create my backpack for my trip, right? For this project. Now I know it's a little bit confusing, and I've actually requested that it shows this black, just kind of how it shows here. But this pipenv install Flask, that's the code we want to run. And I've actually asked for it to be put kind of a little bit easier. But what we do is we make sure we CD into my project folder, right? Right now, if I type ls, there's nothing in there, right? It's just an empty folder. But I make sure that I CD into my project folder. Then I'm going to run this code, pipenv install Flask. So let's do that. pipenv install Flask. Now, what my computer's doing is it's installing Flask in this environment. But one thing to know, if I say pip list, which just kind of shows me what is downloaded, I have a lot of stuff downloaded. One thing you don't see though is Flask. So you're like, wait a second, we just downloaded Flask. There was no issue. What is happening? That's because when we use pip env, what it does is it creates the environment, but now I need to actually access that environment. The way I do that, the way I actually grab my backpack, right, and take what I need is I say pip env shell. By doing this, this activates my environment. I run it. Now you can see right here, it says Flask example. That's my project folder name. Because it says that here, that shows me that my environment is active, right? That shows me my environment is active. So now if I say pip list, let me clear this first because there's a lot going on. Now if I say pip list, and I look, cool, it downloaded Flask. It's downloaded It's Dangerous, which is just a built-in thing with Flask. It's downloaded Jinja, Workzerg. It's got all these things downloaded. Awesome. My environment has the tools I need to complete this hike. Any questions here? Any questions on how to create an environment? Any questions on the folder structure? Any questions how to run the environment?
Just a slight warning to anyone who uses git bash on Windows. It's a thing that they for some reason do on purpose, but you won't have the nice parentheses environment thing when you're running your environment or when you activated your environment. So that pip list is actually a really useful way to ensure that you're in your environment if you forgot.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Yeah. Is that the same thing with command prompt? Is that command prompt act the same way?
Command prompt shows it nicely. Command prompt shows it like that.
Yeah.
But I think both git bash and PowerShell do not. So,
yeah, I think at the beginning, I think we say to use command prompt, and I think that's part of the big reason.
Yeah,
is because then that way you know. But you're right. If you do decide to use git bash, you can just do pip list, and as long as you see Flask in there, cool, your environment is activated. Any other questions? Does that make sense here? Cool. Awesome. So now my environment's activated. I'm in my project. Now let's actually create our first Flask application. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, we're going to backtrack just a little bit. So we're going to talk about, well, what is Flask? Flask is a micro framework, but it is what our server is. So if you can remember, there's this great kind of thing here, the Flask flow. If you can remember all the way back to web fundamentals, right? We talked about this request response cycle. It's where my client makes some sort of request, whether it's a GET request, a POST request. We're going to kind of talk about all those different pieces. But they make some sort of request to a server, right? And my server navigates and says, well, okay, you asked for this request, so I'm going to give you this back. You asked to go back home, so I'm going to send you back to the home page, right? Whatever that is. When we are creating this Flask application, we are creating a web server in the Flask language, which is awesome. So we are creating this server. So we're creating an actual web server that we can make requests to. And then as long as our request is good, it can send something back to my client. So let's go ahead and do that. If we're here into this hello Flask piece, and I know that this caused quite a bit of confusion for a lot of people too, so let's walk through it line by line. What we're going to do first is while I'm here, I'm actually, if I type ls, remember that shows like what is within my folder. I don't see any, oh, I see this pip file, sorry, and this pip lock. That is whenever I activate my environment, that automatically creates these two. And this is a dependencies file basically to show like if somebody were to download this, what are the dependencies and what are the specific things that are needed in order for this application to run and some other metadata like that. But one thing I need is I need an actual server.py file. So one thing you can do if you are on Mac is you say touch. There's two things I could do, right? I could say touch and then server.py. What this will do is this will actually create my server.py file. The other thing I could do is I could just type code and then space period, open that up, and then create a file, you know, in my VS Code. I'm going to do this. So now if I type ls, now you see the server.py file. So now let's open up this code and see what happens. Here, I got access to my pip file, right? This is my packages. This is what I'm needed. This is the source. Here's the version of Python I'm running. And then pip lock is again that other metadata right there. But this is what I'm really worried about is the server.py file. So let's see what this hello Flask thing says. And we're going to get a Flask piece up and running. Well, first off, let's just go line from line. That way I don't have to delete all those other comments. Here in my server.py, if you guys can remember the classes from last week, the OOP, what we're doing is we're saying from Flask, which is what we downloaded, import the class of Flask, right? That's what this capital F Flask, we're importing the Flask class. Now, one thing to note is sometimes you're going to have this unresolved import. That's because VS Code itself has its own terminal, right? And we haven't activated the environment in that terminal, but because we know that we have it activated in my current terminal, we're good to go. We can just go ahead and ignore it. Cool. So we are importing that class. And then from that class, we have got this built-in piece called Flask Dunder name. Now this is, remember, if we're talking about the abstraction from OOP, right? That's one of the 4 pillars. And we're saying, hey, we don't need to know necessarily how something is working in order for us to actually use it. Same case comes here, right? We're creating this variable called app. Then from there, we're using Flask, and then we are instantiating, right? And using this Dunder name. Then we're going to do a couple things. Now, we talked about how my server takes in a request, right? And then it says, okay, here's what I want you to do. Let's just go ahead. This is the way that my Flask application actually does that. Here, I've got this app.route. This app right here comes from here, right? If this was unicorn, this would be unicorn.route. Keep it as app, but they come from here, right? What this is saying is if there is nothing after localhost 5000, which is what the port that Flask runs on, there's nothing after, right? Just a basic localhost 5000. Here's the method I want you to run. This is going to be really important when we're talking about routing and we're talking about a full application, because if my user, says /pizza, but I don't have a /pizza, it's going to break, right? There's going to be some sort of error. But what this is doing is this is saying, if my client gives me a request, right? That's just localhost 5000 /nothing, or just localhost 5000, the / defaults to nothing. Then I want you to run this method, right? Def hello world. Lastly, what we are saying is this last piece right here, make sure that this goes at the bottom of your file. So if you're going to have different app route decorators, make sure it goes at the bottom of that. Don't put it, at the top of anything. Make sure that this is at the complete bottom where we're running app.run debug equals true. Again, that abstraction, you don't necessarily need to know that, what exactly is happening right here, but just understanding that if this name main, there's some metadata in there for Python from right here, right? And we want to run. So what this is saying is, hey, as long as this is good to go, I want you to go ahead and run this code. Cool. So we have set up our first Flask server to where now, if I want, I can go ahead and run this, go to localhost 5000 on my computer because it's set up locally, right? You guys couldn't go to localhost 5000 and see what I have. It's just a local server, basically. But it's spinning up some server that can now take in a request. So if I were to come here, what I first have to do, I make sure my environment is good to go, right? I'm in my folder, and now all I type is Python 3 because I'm on a Mac, just Python if you're on a Windows. And then I type the file name. Now I know a lot of people were getting confused from this hello world, hello Flask assignment. You guys were copy and pasting this thing. One thing to note is if you see, anytime you see this on the platform, you have this $, this is just saying wherever, if I'm looking here for a Mac, it is a percentage sign, but I believe on a Windows, on a command prompt, it is a dollar sign. What this is, whatever's to the left of that on here, that's just saying we're, on your local space where you're at. On the right is what you're actually running, right? So making sure, okay, is your environment active and are you in your folder with the environment? I'm looking. Yep, my environment's active. I'm in my folder. Perfect. Now I can run whatever's on the right-hand side. So if you guys are copy and pasting this and putting in there, it will break, right? It doesn't know what the heck is going on. And so you can say, I don't know what hello Flask is. Even if you have a folder hello Flask and you're doing these percentage or this parentheses, it's going to break. So just kind of moving forward, if you were copy and pasting something from the platform, I would encourage you to make sure if there is a dollar sign, it is whatever's on the right is the actual thing you will put in there. Don't put anything on the left. The left is just supposed to be like where you're at in your directory. So I'm going to run Python 3 and then it said server.py. And this is my file name, right? In the same way that in Python, whenever I was running any sort of Python code, I could just say main.py, doing same sort of thing, right? I'm saying, okay, Python, go ahead and run this code. Now, when I do this, I'm get what we call spinning up my server, right? My server is activating. It says debugger is active, debugger pin. I don't have any sort of errors. So what's happening is that tells me my server is good to go. So for looking at my code, we're saying, remember that the port for Flask is localhost 5000. So what we're saying is when we go there and there's nothing after that, this method will run. And so I should see the words hello world. So let's go to my actual here. And I've got this just kind of built in. It's just, I'll just type it. Localhost. Now, one thing I want to point out is different languages run on different ports. So you might see it and say localhost 8000. Why do I have that? Well, I've taught Django, right? And Django, which is the ORM, that actually uses the port localhost 8000. Flask in itself just uses 5000. So we're going to use localhost 5000 for everything. Anytime you are trying to run your server, you will use localhost 5000. So I didn't put anything. I didn't put a slash or anything, kind of the default. Now, if I run this, I'm expecting it to say hello world. Let's see what happens. Perfect. Ran just like I expected. I made a request to my server. Localhost, if I do the slash, again, it defaults to localhost 5000. So therefore, it matches and makes a request to my server, comes here, finds that request, runs this method, returns just hello world, and that is what I see. Are there any questions on this?
Excuse me, Will. I
Yeah.
have a question.
Yeah.
So this 5000 that we are looking, right? Our server address. Is this something equal to www dot or HTTP? Is it something similar to that, or exactly which portion of that?
Yeah. So basically, if you're using www or HTTPS, that is just a deployed application, right? And so you have like a specific IP address for that. And this, because we're just doing local, right? If you deploy, you're on somebody else's server like AWS or Microsoft or GCP, which is Google cloud provider, right? And then you'll go to whatever instance and you can kind of set up that. So yes, it's the same thing, right? If I go to www.google.com, I'm making a request to that specific browser, to that specific web request, like browser is the correct word, right? I'm making, and then it will send me back some sort of response. In this case, it takes me to the Google homepage. It's doing the same thing here. It's just locally happening on my computer where I'm making some sort of request. It's going to the server, which is on my computer again. It's giving it back hello world. Yeah, exactly.
So
if I were to
means, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, so if I were to say something like /pizza, I didn't create something like that, right? So if I do this, I'm gonna get an error, not found, right? Does not exist, was not found on the server.
So
Great
it
question.
means for actual projects, right? We are always dependent for these Google or AWS, these types of, we need to make a connection to them, like, because all, maybe I'm wrong, all the websites that usually I receive, I always type, okay, www dot, right? So it means for actual project, we are always dependent to Google.
Not always, in the sense of, so cloud computing is obviously taking over the world, and this is a much larger conversation. But you can either spin up, if you have your own server at home, you can connect that, right? Or you can have a cloud computing server. So if you have your own like actual server that you know how to network and set it up to the browser directory and everything like that, you got to think about it like a large phone book, right? Of basically strings that are going through, whether it's, you know, www.google.com/54 blah 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 blah, right? That's just a directory that is out there. You can spin it up locally, like if you have your own server but you know how to connect that, or if you want to put it on a provider like AWS or GCP or Azure, which is Microsoft, you can also do that too. Part of the black belt is you will deploy, right? And if you do deploy on AWS, when you do that, I can access it. Anybody in the world, as long as they have that IP address, can click on that and go to your application. And so you can do that locally. Now, it is 75% cheaper by default. A company that puts their stuff on the cloud, it saves them about 75%. That's a whole other topic. But yeah, you are dependent on a server somewhere that's not your computer. It would be a server, either again, which is in-house, meaning that you have your own server and you've got that all set up in a server room or a server rack, or you depend on a cloud provider, which is what we'll do for the black belt.
And it means we will pay for them for that. If we are deploying to the Google or AWS, definitely there would be a yearly subscription or something we are paying, because they are providing a space for us, right?
Yeah, so basically you pay it. It's again, it's like a pay-as-you-go server. So based on your requests and how many times people request your IP address, like you know, if you have a lot of traffic, then that's taking up server space and you'll pay for that. Now, for the black belt, there's free tiers on Amazon. So for what we're doing, it's free. You do have to put in a credit card, but it's free. But yeah, I mean, if you are creating an actual web application that you're wanting people to use all the time, you will pay for how often people go to your website. That will drive traffic. That will, you know, pay X amount for Amazon or for Google or for Azure, or unless you do it at home, right? But then you have the upfront cost of buying a server, of cooling, of knowing how to set up an entire network, and knowing how to do all that stuff. So there's tons of costs on both sides.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is. After you guys graduate, we do give alumni, free workshops to the Azure material. It's really fascinating. You get 50% off to get, kind of versed in Azure, and then 50% off of getting certified. So it's usually $100, but as an alumni, after you take the workshop, you get a coupon for 50% off. I lead all those. They're awesome. Learn all about cloud computing and how that works.
And that's more like IT field, right? If I'm not wrong?
Nope.
Okay.
As a developer, you will use a cloud, especially like I said, in order to get a black belt, you have to learn how to deploy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Cool. Now, any other questions on this, on what we're doing, on what we're talking about, on creating an actual Flask application? Does this make sense?
Hey, well, I'm curious what the warning is on your VS Code, on the
This
server.profile.
Is it this guy right here?
Yes. Yep.
This one right here? Yeah. So what
you were talking about initially?
Yeah. So this is what I was talking about in the sense of, so here in my terminal, right? If I were to say new terminal, I'm in a Flask example. I don't have pipenv installed in this area. I don't have my environment activated here. So what it's saying is, I don't know what Flask is, right? You don't have that downloaded in this terminal. if I were to come and say server, Python server.py, Python 3, let's see what happens. It says, well, I don't know what Flask is. Now, that's just because of this terminal specifically for VS Code, because I've got my terminal actually running here, right? And this is where I'm running Python server.py. This is where my actual environment is. It's good to go. So if I were to like activate, let's see, I don't even know if I can, if I even have pip env even downloaded here. Yep. So if I were to be here and I were to say pip env install Flask, and then I would say pip env shell. Yeah, so now if I were to come here, it should be able to. Let's actually kill this one because I can't have two running. If you want to kill the server, you just do Control C, or I think it's Option Alt C here. But let's say pip env, sorry, let's say Python 3 server.py. See what happens. Okay, so now it does work, right? I don't know why that linter is still there, because I am now using it to where I can go. And if I were to come back and just do the normal, my server's still running. It's just within VS Code. I'm not sure why that is still there, but it's just mainly it's because of this, right? It's this within VS Code, it's showing that it doesn't have Flask downloaded, which is confusing. It should not show that, especially if since I just downloaded it, but that's it's just a linter thing. So it's not a huge deal. Great question though.
It will use it to kill the server Option C. I mean, I was thinking if I'm exiting the terminal, it will get me out of the server.
Yeah, so if you like exit the terminal and then you say terminate, then that is something. Now, one thing to note, and that's something I've seen, I think with Git Bash, is if you just exit, sometimes it doesn't actually kill the server. And so then you go try to run another server and then it has a big issue. So if that's the case, if you're in Git Bash, you have to make sure either, so if I click this right now, I get something that says terminate, right? So if I'm doing that, it kills everything. Or I can type exit. If you were on Git Bash, it will sometimes not do that. And I've had to problem solve with students. If that happens, you have to go into your task manager and you have to go in and kill Python in itself, and then you can activate a new environment. But that is something that does happen sometimes. So please be aware of that if you're using Git Bash.
So in the Mac, it's Option C.
It's Control C on a Mac.
Oh, Control C. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Control C for if I'm, Python 3 server.py. If my server's running, it's just Control C. And that's kind of universal with every server. And then if I want to actually exit my environment, I just type the word exit. And now you can see my environment is no longer there.
Awesome.
Cool. Is this making sense? Are you guys following? Cool. Lots of ones. Are there any questions up to this point? Again, the entire point of this class is to make sure that we are fully understanding Flask, how to set up Flask virtual environment. So, because this is something we will use every time. So if you do have a question right now, even if other people are getting it, I would really encourage you, ask your questions now, just to make sure that we know what is happening. As always, you can put them in the chat. Last thing I want to talk about is I'm activating my shell. Perfect. Or my environment, sorry. And then I'm going to Python 3 server.py. Perfect. Now, obviously, if I'm creating an application, I don't want it just to be localhost 5000. I want it to be a couple things, right? So what I can do is I can actually say app.route, and I'm going to use this every single time. Every single time I'm creating a route, I'm going to say app.route, and then I'm going to say the route name. Now, note, you do have to have a slash before it. So if you are coming from Django, this is like my views and my URLs are combined, but make sure that you do have a slash at the beginning. And let's say I wanted it to slash pizza. Right? I had the best pizza, one of the best pizzas of my life yesterday. So then it was a banh mi pizza. Oh yeah, it was so good. Okay, so let's say I created a method called eat pizza. Didn't take in anything, and all it returned is return banh mi pizza slaps with 2 S's. Okay, now this is another route I can use for my server, right? So if I come here, I make sure my server's still running. See, because sometimes when I'm typing and my server's running, there can be an error. So I have to come back and say Python 3 server.py. So always make sure if you're doing some sort of code and all of a sudden, code doesn't work, go make sure your server's running. But now if I come here, hello world, now if I say slash pizza, it says banh mi pizza slaps. Okay, so what that tells me is I can set up different routes for my application, which is exactly what we can do. So here, I can set up just another string, but let's say I want to pass in something. Well, what I can do is I can actually pass in values. So let's say I wanted to do something like this to where people could pass in their favorite type of pizza, and then I would say that it slaps. Let's say route. Maybe the route's going to say something like this that says pizza slash. Now, if we're looking, how do we take in some sort of variable, right? Because I don't want to create a route for pepperoni and for sausage. I don't want to create the same thing over and over. I want this to be malleable, right? Where somebody can put something in and then all of a sudden it takes it, right? I have one route that kind of encompasses everything. Now here, what we can do is we can just say these little caret brackets on the side, and then we're going to create a variable name called name. Now, this can be whatever we want it to be. It can be unicorn, it can be cupcake, it can be rainbows, it doesn't matter. Now, obviously, we want to have better convention, right? We want it to be understandable. So here we're going to put in name, but again, it can be whatever you want it to be. It can be X, it can be Y. You have good variable names, but it can be anything you want, right? This is just referring to the value that's being passed through. So here I'm going to put name. Now, when I do put a value after or within my URL, right? I do have, if I have a method, people pizza, that's what I'm gonna call it. It does then have to take in that value, right? So my method has to take in, if I have got a value in my URL, my method has to take in that value, right? There will be an error if it doesn't. So what I can do is return name pizza slaps. Cool. So I'm creating a route that's got a variable in it, right? It is malleable. I can be a pepperoni pizza, a pineapple pizza, anchovies, doesn't matter. Fungus, pillow pizza, I don't know. You can just do whatever random word, right? But then after, what it'll say is that name /slaps. So let's go see. Let's check my server. Is it running? Oh, it's still running. Good to go. I was quick enough. So now if I come to localhost 5000 pizza, it still says banh mi pizza slaps. But what if I say pepperoni? Now it says pepperoni pizza slaps. What if I say kale? Gross. Kale pizza slaps. What if I want to say, I don't know, some random thing? It will take in any sort of value, whatever is passed through. That is what it will take in and create this variable called name. Any questions on that? Somebody asked, does the first pizza need an ending like the second one? Nope, it doesn't, right? So if I add in information, great question on that, Michaela. If I add in additional information, it matches, right? It doesn't say like, well, I do have this one pizza and then another pizza that has slash information. It has to match, right? If I don't have a slash here or a slash, name or whatever, it's only going to go to anytime I say localhost 5000 slash pizza, and that's it. In this case, I say that I've got a variable, so it's pizza slash whatever. So if there is pizza slash and then any sort of characters, it can just be one character, right? I can do something like this. I just say like four pizza slaps. Peter asked if adding a slash at the end. I don't think so, because I think by default it will just go to pizza, but let's try it. Yep. Pizza slash. Great question though. Way to be inquisitive. Cool. Now we can do multiple, right? Where I've got username and I've got ID. I can do as many as I want if I want to do that. Just make sure that your method takes in every single variable that we pass into my URL. Now, one thing that I do want to point out, if we're thinking about this, is somewhere here on the platform, not template. We're going to talk about templates next time. Is what if I don't want it to be just I think it's actually in the video. Let me make sure. Yeah. So what right now, when I am doing this name like this, by default, this is a string, right? Anything after pizza is going to come in as a string. But what if I want to do some sort of multiplication, right? And I want to say at app.route, where I've got pizza slash, oops, pizza slash x slash y, right? And then I say def mult pizza. Sorry, I'm on a little mini keyboard. It's the worst. I have to take in my values. Thank you. We got to catch that. Got to take in my values, right? So I'm going to say x comma y. Then what am I going to do? What if I wanted to return x times y? That's all I want this to do, x times y. Let's see what happens if I do this. Takes that in, that's great. Let's check my server. My server's still running. Let's go to my code. If I say pizza slash 7/6, let's see what happens. There's a type error. Now this is really important because what it's saying is, and we're looking, and this is a Flask error, it's from Workzerger. I don't know how to pronounce it, but that's kind of what's giving us this error, right? In this clinical screen. But we scroll all the way down where it says can't multiply sequence by non-int of type string. Because by default, anytime we pass something into this, right, the /7/6, we are saying that this is a string. That is the default kind of variable type when we're doing that, but we can't do a multiplication with a string. So what I can do, and this is what I would prefer that you guys do, is you can actually typecast your values. So what I can say is int, and what this does is when it passes in this value, it will pass it in as a type of integer, right? That's the type that this variable is, not a string. So if I'm doing this, my server's running and I refresh, it gave me, oh, I gotta go back. And then /7/5 gives me a type error still. Did I not save it? Do not return a valid response. Must be a string.
I think after int, if we put in parentheses.
Yeah. That should have returned just 7.
How about to put parentheses x and y? in the variables. No, at the top, I was thinking where we are saying int colon, because if you put X inside the parentheses here, instead of saying int colon X, because from the fundamentals, if you want to change a variable, a string to integer.
But we are calling that through. So we are typecasting. So I'm wondering if I say something like this. Maybe I just sum X plus Y. And then I say something like the sum is, let's try returning that. I think the return statement is what was having my issue. So let's see. See my server still running. Sometimes if it is not working, I just like to kill you. Sometimes just killing your server is a good idea. If it's not, if you're like, wow, this code should work, and it's not, just sometimes restarting your server is a good thing. So now let's go check. Here we have localhost. We can say the sum is 12. So it looks like it wasn't liking the return of a number, but it should. Yeah, looks like it's not liking that. Must be a string. So and so this is how we can use this, right? The return type. So it looks like for Flask, the return type must be a string, a dictionary, a tuple, a response instance, or an WSGI callable, but it was an int. So it was saying, all right, it doesn't like the fact that it's an int, so I can put that in a string, right? To where I would have to do some sort of variable like this, and then say, I could just say something like this. But it was saying, regardless, it does not like the fact that it is an int. So I have to then, I guess, even typecast it again, back to string, to where it just does 12. Cool. Does that make sense though? That we can typecast. If I wanted to do string, then I would do something like this. I would say string, which is fine. And I think that's a good thing. That's a good habit. So that way you know what sort of data type or what sort of value type that you are working with. But again, by default, it's already a string. But if you wanted to typecast it, make sure that you knew that it was a string. You could type string right here. Any questions on this?
Hey, Bill, I have a question.
Yeah.
So for this, if we comment sum, row 18, right? And for the return, if we put X multiplied by Y and covered by quotation, right? Like to have a quotation and inside the quotation X multiply Y, then do you think it will get us the multiplication?
I do not, because we can try it. I do not, because the multiplication is tied to, right? That's like built-in methodology from an integer, right? An int type. But if we put it in a quotation, it will automatically read that as a string. So what I'm thinking will happen is if I say something like this, return X times Y, I think I will literally just get the string of X times Y. Let's go check and see what happens. Come and I refresh. I just get that, right? Because it is reading, regardless of the logic we have, it is reading it as just a string. That's still running. Even if I were to say something like this, right? Even if I were to say something like return X times Y, it is still going. Now it'll actually just give me the values of each. So it'll say 7 times 5. So I refresh. 7 times 5, right? Because it's still reading it as a string. Multiplication, addition, subtraction, division, all of those are reserved for integer types, floats, whatever, any sort of number, right? We're going back to those primitive types, but because this is a string, it doesn't have access to multiplication. So what I would do if I wanted that actual value is I would say like mult equals X times Y, and then I would just say something like oops. Somebody said, oh, my server's not running anymore. We're on Python server 3. Oh, there's an indentation error. Just so you guys know, a tab is 4 spaces. So right there, I counted and I just had 3. That's kind of how I problem solved, right? It was like this. Oops. It was like it had just 1 space deleted. And so I counted and said, oh, it's only 3. I need 4. Just so you guys know for an intention type. So this should do it. I gotta start my server again. Sorry, friends. Perfect. This says 35. Peter, you said let's do F and then X times Y. Let's try that. That probably would work. So it's I said, I don't know that it'll work. Let's try it. Because it is, let's try it. Yeah. I typed in 6. 42. Cool. So Peter was correct. We could just do, you still got to put it as a string, but then I gives you X times Y within that value. So we don't even need that. Good call. Any questions on this stuff, friends? That's all I have. We're going to talk about rendering templates, session and forms next week or on Wednesday. But any questions? I just really wanted to make sure that we fully understand how do we create a Flask application or a server? How do we, what are the main pieces of that? How do we do our virtual environment? How do we install Flask? Any questions?
Yeah, I've got a question about the sequencing of the routes. Came up when I was working on, well, basically this program on the last task. So if I'm understanding correctly, it's looking for an exact match on each route. So it doesn't really matter what sequence these are in. If it comes up with that exact match, then it gives that back. So like the last task is if they put in something other than any of these routes, it gives a different response. So I put that at the end and then kind of played with it, and it looked like it didn't matter where I put it. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't assuming incorrectly.
Yeah, no, that is correct. It doesn't matter where you put it. So if this part was, up here, that's totally fine. It doesn't matter. It is looking for that exact match. Now, obviously, as we're building code, there's going to be something we call RESTful routing, where we get, and we'll talk about that, where we kind of start, combining like things. So if I'm still dealing, well, pizza doesn't make sense with this number thing, but right here I have pizza and I have pizza some string name, and we're building on that base route of pizza. That's something that we'll get to, but yeah, for right now, it's just looking for that route. So it's going to go top to bottom and look for that. Sequential programming, top to bottom in the sequence. Any questions on that? Any other questions, friends? Versus async, sequential versus async. Again, sequential is just top to bottom. Async means that other things can run too. Cool. I know that today was a little bit slower. I know that it wasn't as much information. We'll have a lot of that on Wednesday. I just want to make sure that we're all in a good space before we move on to Wednesday, where we talk about session and forms and rendering templates and templating engines. So today, Wednesday, will be a little bit heavier day. But I really just wanted to make sure that we all had a good understanding, because I did get quite a few emails this weekend just for understanding and not having an understanding. If you guys could put a 1 or a 0, that would just really help me make sure that we know, and I can kind of get off and stop beating a dead horse. Cool. Peter, you raised your hand. Go ahead, friend.
Yeah, I had a random side question on because one of the bonus challenges at some point was like a ninja challenge was just sort of out of left field, and it was like basically like handle the situation if someone puts in something that you don't have, like a route that you don't have. And I just Googled it and found like there's an app.error handler and ran with that. Is that what you would use? I'm just curious because there was no like confirmation of that in the video, I don't think so.
Sure. Let's look at that on the office hour. I believe that so like for Django, there was a base route that you could do at the end that if none of them matched, then it encompassed whether you had 1,000,000 slashes or 1 slash it encompassed.
Sure, sure, sure.
I believe Flask has it. I don't remember what it is, but I believe Flask does have that. But let's hit that on Wednesday, and then we can kind of circle back with that. It's a great question. So what Peter's basically asking is, if none of these are true, instead of me coming localhost 5,000 of Rhino and it's saying, well, I don't know what that is. We don't want this not found, right? It would at least either you could do an error handling. So if you have a 404 error and direct them to like, hey, sorry, we don't have this page, or by default, go somewhere else. So let's try this in chat. Looks like there is a, now you do want to make sure that this is at the, oops. Route that says path. Perfect. And then I'm gonna say def error. Doesn't take in anything, and maybe I'm gonna return to oops. Looks like we don't have that page. Let's check it. Check my server, still running. Now if I come here, oh.
Yeah, you mentioned it should take in path.
Yep, that was just a show. No, whoops, we don't have that page. What if I say Rhino / heart? Whoops, we don't have that page. Cool. There you go. Thank you for that. Now this will take in any sort of path that you have, and if it gets to this point, then it will run whoops. Now, what's really important to know, Kevin, you asked, does the order make sense or matter? No, unless you're talking about this guy. So if I'm here and I have path, right? Because it does go sequentially from top to bottom, it will read this one first, and it's kind of like that conditional statement, right? This will render true. And so even if I were to say pizza, it's going to say, whoops, don't have that page. Oh, it does say that. Oh, interesting. Weird. Okay, so I guess this in Flask, it doesn't matter. And this is just an all-encompassing at the end. In Django, the way it worked was if you did it at the beginning, it would just take in any sort of path. But looks like it reserves that and runs it at the end no matter what. So it's good to know. Cool. I would still reserve that for the bottom, just the way that I would set up the application. But as you can tell, it still works. But yeah, I would reserve that for the bottom still. Great questions, friends. Any other questions for this code?
I had less of a question and more of a comment also that I just wanted to note for you that because you guys were talking about the server PY thing at the beginning and everything, and that whole naming convention and that everything should have a server. They originally listed server.py and then like right on the next lesson, just like switched gears and started calling it hello.py the entire time instead of server. Just something to note in the lessons.
Yeah, that is it here?
I think that's where they first say server, and then if you like continue through, keep going.
Hello.
I think it's rendering views like templates and stuff. Is
Okay.
where you start getting to.
The code.
Yes, see like hello Flask / hello py. They start calling it hello.py there.
Oh
on
yeah.
that, like header. Yeah. So.
Oh yeah, right there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
they
good.
start
That's
referring to it as that the whole time. So.
interesting. Yeah. Okay. I'll reach out to them on that. Cool. Any other questions, friends? Great job. All right, well, that's all I have for you tonight. I will make sure that these get uploaded right away, and that way you have access to them. If you guys have any questions, obviously feel free to reach out on Discord. Oh, one thing I do want to point out is in this, if you guys have, if you're really struggling or you need something, I have my personal Calendly right here. So you can obviously do a code review for any sort of Python instructor. We will meet there. But if you specifically have something with me or with the class, or you just feel like you're really struggling, you need a good pep talk, my personal link is right here. So this will be with my calendar. So you'll make sure you get me. So just something I wanted to add for you. But other than that, friends, that's all I have for you tonight. And I hope you have a wonderful night. We'll see you on Wednesday.